All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to this side event at the 2022 WTO Trade and Environment Week. This event focuses on the new WTO agreement on fisheries subsidies. Anyone who can't hear us can use the little headphones here. My name is Alice Tipping. I lead work on trade policy at the International Institute for Sustainable Development based here in Geneva. And a special welcome to all of you who have joined us in the room today and all of you who have joined us also online. And a note to those of you who are joining us online, please feel free to put questions or comments that you would like to add into the discussion into the chat box, not the Q&A box, the chat box. I have a colleague who will monitor it and send me by rapid WhatsApp message comments that you may want to add into the discussion. So please don't feel that just because you're not here in the room in Geneva that you're not part of this discussion, because you very much are. So thank you for joining us. Now, as many of you in the well aware, WTO members agreed at the 12th Ministerial Conference on a new set of binding multilateral rules to curb harmful fisheries subsidies, creating, as they did so, the first WTO agreement with an environmental objective. This makes it, of course, a particularly relevant topic for discussion at this Trade and Environment Week. So the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement aims to ensure that governments consider the legality and the sustainability of the fisheries they subsidize, thereby helping to make fishing more sustainable and thus protecting the long-term livelihoods of fishing communities. The agreement is just a first step in several ways. First, there were some important obligations on the table that were not agreed and that were left for further negotiations, which aim to conclude by the next ministerial conference. And second, it's a first step in that members now need to ratify or accept this existing agreement and need to work on implementing its provisions. The agreement that we have, though, is deeply significant. It's important for the WTO because it demonstrates that governments can choose to use the rules of this House to address global environment issues. And it's important for the environment because the economics of fishing are as important as scientific efforts to manage the resource. So this event will tell many of you things that you already know about the agreement, but hopefully it will tell you some things that you didn't know about the agreement and about what happens next. And to do this, I'm delighted to welcome next to me on both sides of this panel, first Seina Boutal, who is the acting head of the fisheries subsidies work at the World Trade Organization's Secretariat. We've asked her to do what she can do better than almost anyone, which is to explain the agreement that was reached in June and what it contains. We're then going to hear from one of the NGOs that has been following this discussion most closely, and that's the Pew Charitable Trusts, represented by Ernesto Fernandez Monge, who's a senior officer in the conservation support team at Pew. And we've asked Ernesto to give us his reflections, both on the environmental importance of this agreement, but also on the importance of the next steps of work and the implementation of those new rules. We're then going to hear from one of the most important negotiators of the agreement, and that's Assane Touré, who was first secretary at the Permanent Mission of the Republic of the Gambia to the United Nations and also to the WTO. And Assane isn't used to being on the podium, but that's fine. We've asked him for his perspective on what concrete actions will be needed domestically to implement this new agreement, whether any of those implementation steps may be more challenging, and what kinds of assistance might be most useful to support implementation. And last, but clearly not least, I'll be pleased to give the floor to my own colleague, Tristan Irschlinger, who is Policy Advisor Fisheries Subsidies at IISD. And Tristan is going to present a self-assessment tool that IISD is just about to publish, which we have put together essentially to support WTO members' efforts to prepare for and guide their implementation of this agreement. Now, this tool is not yet public. If any of you in the room are environment negotiators and not rules negotiators, don't tell your rules colleagues that you have seen it yet. This is a sneak preview, but it will help you, I think, to see how the implementation of these rules might take place. And for many of you who are environment experts, to immediately see the links between the provisions of this agreement and environmental policy. So with those words of introduction, I'm delighted to pass the floor first to you, Say. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alice. And if I may ask you, Kathy, if we can put this on so I can see. Okay, I guess we can do it ourselves. Yeah. Well, whilst we're waiting, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your kind words, Alice. And I do see a lot of familiar faces in this room, so I'm not sure if I'm the best person to provide an overview of the agreement, but surely I'll try my best, and I look forward to this discussion. And just a word of warning, if anybody hears me cough, please don't panic. I have a toddler and they're walking germs, so everything is good. Okay, so if the clicker, back to it. Is that you or me? That's the end. Okay. All right. So my presentation today will focus on providing an overview of the agreement, as well as what members need to do in terms of the next steps. I think I have 15 minutes, so I'll be quite brief, but I'm happy to take questions as we go along or after the various presentations. So first, just to give you a background, as everybody knows, we have the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. Oh. Technical difficulties, 1 second. We do have currently existing at the WTO, the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. WTO being a trade-related organization has these disciplines to discipline trade distortive measures, effects of subsidies. These are prohibited subsidies in the forms of export subsidies and import substitution, as well as adverse trade effects type subsidies. So where does the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement fit in this? What the ASCM does not do is focus on subsidies that negatively affect sustainability or natural resources, and in this case, fisheries resources. So this is not addressed in the ASCM, and a number of members, originally named the Friends of Fish, did come together and decide that perhaps this is something that WTO should be looking at. So that was the, apologies, this clicker is a bit slow, but that was really the start of the discussion of whether we should have a mandate within the WTO. But moving forward to 2001, where it was first mandated, at the Doha Ministerial, members agreed to clarify and improve the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures with rules that link the environment and developing countries and LDC concerns. During the launch of the Doha round, that was the mandate. However, in Hong Kong, there was an elaboration of this mandate, which then decided to be further targeted towards prohibiting certain forms of subsidies, fishery subsidies, that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, with special and differential treatment as an integral part of the negotiations. Members at that time, though work was slow, did continue with the negotiations. However, the real impetus came in 2015, where the Sustainable Development Goals were decided at the leadership level, so at the head of state level. And in the SDGs, we have Target 14.6, which further elaborates that by 2020, so giving a deadline that subsidies, that the WTO should work on negotiations to prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and eliminate subsidies to IUU fishing, with SNDT as an integral part of the negotiations. So from 2015, this impetus was given to the negotiations, and we saw a huge drive towards concluding these negotiations, giving about 5 years as a timeline to conclude the negotiations. Fast forward to 2017, at the MC11 in Argentina, there was a ministerial decision that at that time to conclude the negotiations by MC12. MC12 was scheduled for 2019, but as we all know, many things happened from 2020 onwards. We don't need to list all of them, but MC12 did still happen. It happened in June of this year. So at least to me, we did meet our deadline because we did conclude the negotiations at MC12 as mandated by the MC11 ministerial decision. So the decision, you can find it in the document that I've highlighted there. This is MIN 22 W33. This is for those of you that are familiar with WTO documents. It's publicly available, of course. And at the ministerial, this agreement, not only did we have the outcome on fishery subsidies, but also was open for acceptance by WTO members. So from then, the agreement has been in place in terms of open for acceptance. However, we also have additional work to be done, which is what I will talk about later in terms of the second wave negotiations. So as Alice had mentioned earlier, we do see this as a historic achievement. First, because for the WTO, this is the first agreement that does have sustainability at its core. And it's very fitting that we're here today talking about this in the Trade and Environment Week, given that there are other issues that are being talked about within this parameter of trade and environment. And second, also because it's the second, it's only the second agreement reached at the WTO since its establishment in 1995. May you press next, please? Thank you. So this is just a quick overview of the agreement. This is what we call our architecture of the agreement. So I'll quickly run through it before I go into the details. So we have a scope. We have 3 main prohibitions. We have a prohibition for subsidies to IUU fishing. That's illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Then we have a prohibition for subsidies to overfish stocks. And finally, a prohibition for subsidies for fishing in the unregulated high seas. We also have what we call other provisions, which are other disciplines, which are more in the form of special care and due restraint provisions. This is the first one being for vessels not flying the flag of a member, and the second being for fishing of unassessed stocks. There also exists cross-cutting rules. And I think here we have 3 cross-cutting rules that are written at the bottom there. I don't know if you can minimize the. Oh. So there's the institutional arrangements, notification and transparency, and technical assistance and capacity building. Sorry, this is a bit glitchy. Yeah. Oh. So yeah, well, so this was the overall architecture, as you can see, and then I'll go into the details of some of these provisions. This is just to give you an overall picture of what the framework of the agreement. Perhaps if I can sit there and do it, might be easier. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So first, the scope. What does the agreement cover? The scope of the agreement covers, of course, subsidies as defined under the Agreement of Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. And these subsidies should be specific. So it's very similar to the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. And specifically for the Fishery Subsidies Agreement, that we're covering wild marine capture fishing and fishing related activities that take place at sea. What is outside of the scope, therefore, as a consequence of this, is aquaculture, inland fishing, and onshore activities. So this is just an illustration of what we call the fisheries jurisdiction, and I'm showing you this this image because when we go into the disciplines, you'll see that there are various jurisdictions that are responsible for different parts of the ocean and the application of this agreement. So what we have first is what we call the coastal state, and as it is a state that has a coastline, basically, and the coastal state is responsible for activities within its exclusive economic zone. That's normally 200 nautical miles from the coastline. Then there's also the high seas and the various actors that have jurisdiction in the high seas. So first we have the regional fisheries management organizations and associations. I think it's just behind my picture over there. They're responsible for species under their competence or areas within the high seas. And then we also have the flag state, and they're responsible for the activities within their vessels once they're in the high seas or elsewhere in the ocean. And those are the regional fisheries organizations. So that is basically the jurisdiction of fisheries within the seas that also help frame the responsibilities within our disciplines. And I'll go into some detail of that next. So first on the IUU prohibition. So as I mentioned, we have various actors that are responsible for the triggering. So the prohibition, as I mentioned before, is a prohibition on subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing. So what has to happen first is that a determination of IUU must be made. And so who makes that determination? For the sake of our agreement, we have the coastal member, we have the flag state, we have the RFMO and A that make these determinations and where they make these determinations. So as I showed you previously, these jurisdictions of the oceans gives you an indication of where they are responsible for making those determinations. So for the coastal state, it's the exclusive economic zone. For the RFMO and A, it's for areas of species within their jurisdictions, particularly in the high seas, and sometimes overlapping within the EEZ if the stocks are straddling. And for the flag state, it's for within their own vessels. And then there are certain provisions or procedural steps that should be taken by coastal members in terms of making their IUU determinations as indicated in the agreement. So for the coastal state, it has to be a final IUU determination. Normally, as members were discussing what a final IUU determination is, this is a determination that's either in a listing or has gone through the whole domestic procedure of to be considered IUU. So it's gone through the full jurisdiction, the full local domestic laws and procedures in determining IUU. It's also based on relevant factual information, and there's an opportunity to exchange information with the flag state. Requirement is that requirement must be also satisfied in order to trigger the prohibition. So once a determination is made and it's a final finding, then the prohibition can be triggered, which means that the subsidizing member of that IUU vessel or operator should remove the subsidy. For the RFMO and A, it's also required to have a final listing of IUU, determination of a vessel or operator, and has to be based on the applicable procedures of an RFMO and A and international law, including the notification and provision of information. So once an IUU determination is made by either of these entities, then the subsidizer must stop the subsidy to the vessel or operator, and it must also take into account the proportionality of the infringement, as well as notify the measures that it has taken to remove the subsidy. Then we have the second prohibition, which is the prohibition on overfish stocks. And so the prohibition as it works is that once a stock is determined to be in an overfish state, the prohibition is triggered. So the subsidizing member must remove the subsidy. So the discipline also provides provisions with regards to what it constitutes an overfished stocks. And this is normally based on some sort of scientific analysis or alternative reference points. So we do refer to what the environment and science community consider the biologically sustainable level. So a stock is overfished when it is under the biologically sustainable level in this case. And the coastal member and the RFMO have jurisdiction to make a determination of overfished stocks. So as we mentioned before, with our map of the sea, the coastal member can make the determination within their exclusive economic zone, and it should be based on evidence of best scientific evidence available to it, and using reference points such as maximum sustainable yield or other reference points that are commensurate to the data available. So this other reference points is an indication that there's flexibility in terms of the type of science that's used based on the data and the capacity of the coastal state. For the RFMO, similarly, it can make the determination of an overfished stock within the area and for species under its competence, also based on the best scientific evidence available. So once a determination is made, excuse me, then the subsidizing member must stop the subsidy to that stock that has been determined to be overfished. Unless, of course, and I don't know if you can see that, but unless the subsidizing member can demonstrate that there are other measures in place or the subsidy itself is designed to rebuild that stock. And finally, the third prohibition is for prohibition of subsidies to fishing in the unregulated high seas. This is a much more straightforward prohibition. So essentially is that no subsidizing member should subsidize vessels to fish in the unregulated high seas. And from the map I showed you before, so we have the jurisdiction where the coastal state makes determinations. We have jurisdictions in the high seas where RFMOs make a determination, but there are pockets of the high seas that are not regulated because they're outside of the jurisdiction of either an RFMO or a coastal state. So those are the pockets of the sea we're talking about here, and therefore no subsidies should be provided to fish in those areas of the sea. So beyond the three main prohibitions, as I mentioned before, we have the special care and due restraint prohibitions, which are for special care and due restraint for vessels not flying the flag of a member, and also for fishing of unassessed stocks. We should also note here that there's a provision that does provide an exception for disaster relief. So if a coastal state or members, if there's an instance of a disaster, natural or otherwise disaster, there's an exemption from the main prohibitions in the agreement. So special and differential treatment, as you know, special and differential treatment is normally afforded to developing countries and LDCs in various WTO agreements, and that is the case as well for the agreement on fishery subsidies. In this case, we have several provisions that do provide this special S&DT to developing countries and LDCs. First and foremost, in the main prohibitions of IUU and overfished stocks, there exists a peace clause, which means that that dispute settlement will not apply for 2 years to developing countries and LDCs as of entry into force of the agreement, and also and that is limited within the exclusive economic zone of the developing country or LDC. We also have in the notification and in the notification requirements, normally the notification requirement is to submit your notification every 2 years, but for developing members under members with a share of global fish stocks that are under 0.8%, and for LDCs, this has been extended to every 4 years. Furthermore, there is a special care and due restraint for LDC members in terms of exercising this special care and due restraint when raising matters related to LDCs, and also keeping into consideration their capacity when raising these matters. And finally, technical assistance and capacity building. We do have an article that encourages members to provide necessary technical assistance and capacity building to developing countries and LDCs with the view to help them implement these disciplines. And this article also envisages the establishment of a voluntary WTO funding mechanism, which we call the Fish Fund. So very briefly on the Fish Fund. It is envisaged within the agreement itself, and the objective of this fund is to help developing members and LDCs integrate fishery sustainability elements into their fishery subsidies policy and practices. It also is intended to strengthen sustainable fisheries management systems and help members comply with their notification and transparency obligations. So very briefly on the next steps. So we have the agreement, we have the disciplines, but of course, for it to have any effect, it needs to enter into force. And at the WTO, entry into force generally means that we need 2/3 of WTO members to have deposited their instrument of acceptance, which for some members, this means to ratify at the domestic level or go through whatever domestic procedure is required to deposit this instrument of acceptance. So this is just an overview of what depositing an instrument of acceptance means to the WTO. This is available on the WTO Fishery Subsidies website, just giving guidance of what kind of elements should be provided in providing your instrument of acceptance. And also our legal division colleagues are very are happy to assist any member in discussing further how these templates do work. So they've also informed us just recently that their doors are open for this assistance. So once the agreement enters into force, by virtue of Article 9 of the agreement, we'll have the Committee on Fisheries Subsidies would be established. And the purpose of this committee would be to basically deal with the operation of the agreement. What is also envisaged in the institutional framework of this agreement is what we call in typical W terms an annual review, which is a review that goes through the Committee on Trading Goods of the agreement, as well as now something that is new to the that is kind of new to WTO agreements is a periodic review. So the idea is that within 5 years after entry into force of the agreement and 3 years thereafter, the agreement can be reviewed with a view of making recommendations to make it more effective if needed. Then, as I mentioned before, there are notification and transparency requirements, and the obligation here is to provide notifications on top of your, thank you so much, on top of the members' subsidies and countervailing measures agreement notifications under Article 25. So the additional information required would be fisheries related information. So upon entry into force, members would be required to provide any information of their membership to RFMOs or arrangements. And then within 1 year after entry into force, members would be required to provide information relating to measures concerning implementation and administration of the agreement and the description of their fisheries regimes. Thereafter, members are also required to provide information on the list of vessels and operators that have been engaged in IUU. So the final findings, essentially, of IUU. And finally, every 2 years, or 4 years for those members that are under the 0.8 de minimis or LDCs, to provide certain information relating to, pardon me, the kind of fishing activity that the subsidies provided, and to the extent possible, some very fisheries management related information, such as the status of stocks, the fleet capacity, vessels, names, and catch data. So the purpose of providing all this information is to ensure the effective operation of the agreement. Because for instance, in IUU, in order for members to ensure that it's operational and that the subsidies are prohibited or are removed after an IUU determination, there needs to be a notification that a vessel has been determined as being engaged in IUU. And similarly, for overfished stocks, we will require information on the status of fish stocks in order to determine that, in order for the subsidy to be prohibited. Finally, so I did talk about the review, the 5-year review within Article 9 of the agreement. However, as Alice was saying earlier on, that we do have much more work to do. And this brings us to the last part, which is the second wave of negotiations. So already within the disciplines, we have Article 12, which many call the termination clause or the sunset review. And the idea of this is to ensure that whatever was outstanding from the ministerial is negotiated and provides an incentive to actually conclude those negotiations, at the least, or at the most, actually, by within 4 years after entry into force. However, there is a ministerial decision where members agreed that we should continue these negotiations on outstanding issues with an aim to providing recommendations by the 13th Ministerial Conference. So that is give or take a year and a few months. And within that decision as well, there was a specific mention to overcapacity and overfishing as a focus area for these second wave negotiations, with recognizing that special and differential treatment should be an integral part. So that is it for me. I hope I didn't take too much time, and happy to answer any questions thereafter. Thank you.
That was super, Say. Thank you very much indeed. And I think that's given us an extremely good, in fact, very comprehensive overview of exactly what's in this new agreement. I'm going to give the floor next to Ernesto. You might find it easier, Ernesto, to run the... You can try the clicker.
Or I can
While
keep changing slides if you're done.
While we load up the next set of slides, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that, you know, from the perspective of a trade and environment audience. What you will have heard through Say's presentation is just how many times this treaty and the rules in this treaty build on and in fact rely on environmental and fisheries management rules, right? So the IUU subsidy rule depends on members' enforcement of their IUU, their fishing regulations in their domestic circumstances. It depends on regional fisheries management organizations and their determinations of what is or isn't illegal fishing. And it's on the basis of those environmental rules that we members have built a series of rules on the subsidies that apply to that activity, right? So I think it's a really interesting example of how trade rules can be built on the basis of existing environmentally focused resource management rules. So with that neat segue, we have Ernesto's slide. So Ernesto, tell us what you think of the next steps in this agreement and the environmental importance of implementation. Go ahead.
Thank you, Alice, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, ISD, and thank you, the WTO Secretariat, for organizing this session. Since it's the first time that I addressed the WTO and the members, I would like to congratulate you for this important achievement. Not only members but also the Secretariat. I think it's important to give recognition to this important step. So let's go to the just an announcement. I put some fish pins at the entrance of the room. So if you want to You can please go ahead and pick up 1 or 2 or 3, I don't know, as many as you want, and show support for the ratification of the agreement as soon as possible. Let's go to the first one. So a little bit of what I'm going to talk about, as Alice mentioned. Yeah, I'm just going to try to give it some perspective of from the conservation or sustainability perspective of the importance of the agreement and about the implementation. I will talk about that perspective from the civil society perspective and angle, and then talk about a little bit of some reflections on implementation, focusing on the 3 main pillars of the prohibition, and then I will finalize with some also comments about potential impact, something that we're trying to develop. Next. So from the environmental perspective, for us, this is, as Alice mentioned, first step, an important first step to address the problem, which is overfishing. And I think in this respect, we believe that the agreement does comply with the dual mandate that the WTO members had, both as I mentioned, from the SDG 14.6 and the Buenos Aires Declaration. Also, we also believe that this is an important contribution to improve ocean governance. There are many existing international agreements that deal with the oceans. So this is another puzzle, or a piece of the puzzle in terms of trying to improve ocean governance. And we know that there might be other agreements that will be coming in the future to address the health of the oceans. Alice mentioned this important element, and I think cannot be underestimated, which is that this is the first binding WTO agreement that deals with trade and sustainability. As I mentioned, we have the SEM agreement that deals with certain requirements, maybe more economic requirements, but now we have more sustainability requirements that will be able to address the concerns related to the environment and the health of the fish stocks. This agreement also improved the standard that we know from regional trade agreements. We know, for instance, the USMCA and the CPTPP already have rules on disciplines on fishery subsidies. More recently, the UK and New Zealand agreement also have certain rules. But and I think this is the first time after 25 years, because before the WTO was the standard setting for international trade rules, and then they came the regional trade agreements that were forward-looking, trying to include new topics. But now with this agreement, our assessment is that now the WTO is back again in setting up the standards, in this case for fishery subsidies. I think this agreement will contribute to make governments accountable, and I think in this respect also civil society has a role to play to make that happen. I think the agreement contribute to better alignment between subsidy policies and sustainability objectives, and in this respect, it will be a catalyst for a broader fishery reform. Also, in our view, in this agreement, because I think there has been some interpretation of this, in our view, all subsidies, including capacity enhancing, are covered by the agreement, by the scope of the Articles 3, 4, and 5. Because since there was one of the elements that is outstanding and was not included in the agreement, which is the list of subsidies that contribute to our fishing oil capacity. Some people are saying that not all subsidies to our fishing oil capacity or the capacity enhancing were not included, but in our view that's not the case. So I think this is an important point to make. We agree transparency requirements are important, and as I explained very thoroughly all the elements, but but I wanted to highlight a couple that I think are important from the conservation perspective, and is, for instance, the fact that members now will have to notify their fisheries regime and also conservation and management measures. And this will allow the WTO members and also hopefully the civil society to scrutinize how members are implementing and how members are providing subsidies to the fishing that they're doing. So I think those are very important elements in the transparency and notification requirements. And finally, the commitment to add further disciplines on overfishing or capacity rules. Sort of kind of a building agenda, but I think it's important for members to continue this process and to include other harmful subsidies not covered by Articles 3, 4, and 5, and I highlight the subsidies related or that contributed to overfishing on overcapacity, and subsidies for fishing contingent upon fishing in areas beyond national jurisdiction, or what we call distant water fishing. We see that this element as a fundamental step to improve the effectiveness of the agreement. So we have a bigger coverage in terms of the ICs, but also the fishing in foreign exclusive economic zones. So I think that I will conclude that on the environmental perspective. So let's move to the next slide, and I will start providing some reflections on or thoughts on the implementation and looking at the disciplines of illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. Well, this, in our view, is another tool that members will have in the for combating IUU fishing. We recognize as at the low end of the spectrum for implementation that there's an existing vessel list of RFMOs. There's also the coastal state determinations, but at least you have and this is 150 vessel list that if the agreement enters into force tomorrow, those vessels will no longer be able to receive any subsidies. So at the lower end, we have already an impact, could have an impact. Then on the higher end of the spectrum of implementation, we know, for instance, from FAO, and this is information or data from a little bit old, from 2009, but 1 in 5 fish is caught illegally. This is about 20% globally. In some regions might be more, maybe 30%. But this gives an indication that if members increase their implementation of the IUU disciplines, the disciplines could target this 20% global illegal fishing. Then the other element will be this agreement will contribute to the implementation of the unregulated, unreported elements of the IUU, which is important. It's not settled how this is going to be applicable, but I think having the agreement will encourage greater implementation of these two elements. And I'll give you an example of an unregulated stock, looking at the RFMOs. The South Pacific albacore is covered by certain RFMOs, but it's not regulated. So I think there is an incentive, if members want to continue providing subsidies to this fishery, that they start talking about management measures, because otherwise, if the agreement enters into force tomorrow, those fishing this stock could lose their subsidies. So we believe that the agreement could have a chilling effect on RFMOs now that there are these rules, and we know that there's certain stocks that are unregulated. And next. Now, on thinking about the disciplines on overfish stocks, the effectiveness of Article 4 will depend on how loose or how strict members are in implementing the flexibility that is provided in Article 4.3. We know the main rule is clear. If there is scientific evidence that a stock is overfished, then a member must stop the subsidies. But then the question is if there are subsidies or other measures that are implemented to rebuild the stock. So how members are going to implement this, if this is we have a robust implementation of these disciplines, we might have an increased level of prohibition of subsidies. But it's something that that will depend very much on how members implement. There are resources available, scientific evidence out there that could be useful. There is the RAM Legacy Stock Assessment Database, or the Chris Costello Global Fisheries Database that build on the stocks that are not covered by the RAM Legacy database. So I think this could provide at least some important reference for members. So a point that I wanted to highlight in Article 4 is the fact, and Sai mentioned this very well, is the issue of the biological sustainable level and the requirements to make that determination of the overfish stocks. And this, from thinking about a conservation perspective, the WTO now has set an important standard that members need to follow from the environmental perspective. So we see this as a very extremely important step in the WTO. Next. Now moving to the Article 5, specifically on the unregulated high seas prohibition. Pew commissioned a project to develop distant water fishing subsidies atlas. This was with the University of California, Santa Barbara, and this tool uses vessel activity information from Global Fishing Watch and the global estimates, subsidy estimates from Rashid Sumaila from the University of British Columbia. They were able to look at the fishing vessel activity in all FAO high seas areas and also the exclusive economic zones of coastal states to determine the fishing effort by vessel and assign a subsidy ratio for each vessel. So in this area 41, the Southwest Atlantic Ocean, they were able to determine that there are 577 vessels that fish more or less a little bit more than 543 million kilowatt hour in fishing effort, fueled by $515 million annually. This, if you can see, 91% of those subsidies are provided by these four in the red box for entities: China, South Korea, Spain, and Chinese Taipei. You can see that in the map, you can see the concentration of the effort in front of the exclusive economic zone of Argentina, where the yellow more yellow pixels are. This is an area where there's no an RFMO, and there is a lot of squid fishing. So there's one stock that most of the fishing is concentrated in this stock and is taking place. And squid is generally not covered by our RFMO. So if the agreement will enter into force tomorrow, fishing squid subsidies that are provided to the squid fishing will be prohibited. So this situation again might preempt countries to start thinking about putting management measures. So this is an important element to consider and how this could be implemented right away. Next. This is another example also for the unregulated high seas. Looking at the other side of South America in the Southeastern Pacific, where also there is a lot of squid fishing, by the way. Here there are 570 vessels that have 626 million kilowatts hour of fishing effort, fueled by 630 million dollars. You can see again the same actors providing most of the subsidies. And again, as you can see, the bulk of the effort is close to the Club Economic Zone, close to the Galapagos, and also in front of the jurisdictional waters of Peru. As you can see, it's very close, so some vessels might just are tempted probably to cross over the 200 nautical mile limit, and this could potential. There's a lot of potential for IUU fishing as well. Next. And just to put this more into perspective or into context, according to the SOFIA report, the latest SOFIA report from the FAO, thinking about this area 87 of the FAO, the report says that 66.7% of the fishing taking place in this area is unsustainable. So that means that the numbers that we saw on the previous slide, at least 66% of that effort and those subsidies are provided to unsustainable fishing. Next. Now, thinking about the potential impacts, we are trying to look, this is an ongoing work that we're doing. We're looking at the potential impact of the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, trying to look at how many of the $22 billion of the global estimate for harmful fishery subsidies that was estimated by Rashid Sumaila will be affected by the disciplines. So one potential conclusion for us is that with this assessment is that the effectiveness of the agreement will depend on how well members apply management measures, monitoring and enforcement measures, and this will be a good gateway to the issue of implementation that we will see later in our conversation. But the preliminary assessment also give us a kind of a range of subsidies that will be subject to the disciplines. On the lower estimate, it's about $1.3 billion, which is more or less a little bit under 10% of the 22 billion, or could be as high as $7.9 billion, which closer to 30% of the total. Again, we're looking at this and doing a lot of assumptions because, you know, obviously there's not a lot of data and difficult to find all the information, but at least they will give us an indication, and this could be a conservative estimates because we're focusing, unfortunately, only on industrial fishing. It's hard to find information on small scale fishing, which give us the opportunity just to say that this is conservative, so it could be more subsidies that could be affected. And just final, please, the next. Finally, just final thought. We believe that the members need to act, so the agreement on fisheries subsidies enter into force as soon as possible. As you can see here from the latest SOFIA report, again, 35.4% of the stocks has overfished. It started back in 1974 at 10%, and around 2000, when the negotiations started, was around 27%. So the decline continues. So we hope that once the agreement enters into force, we will be able to revert this trend. So with that, I'm finished and hope that I can provide some responses to the questions.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Ernesto. And I think A lot of those really interesting maps give us a sense of exactly where the rules might have a particular impact. But I thought one of your last points was almost the most important, that at the end of the day, the effectiveness and the impact of this agreement is going to depend on how members implement the rules, whether they read them ambitiously or not, and also on the actual fisheries management and environmental provisions they already have in place and how they manage their subsidy programs along with their resource management programs. So implementation. Hassan, what are you currently thinking about in terms of looking forwards towards implementation and some of the challenges that might be in the road?
Thanks, Alice, and thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I think maybe first at the outset, maybe just to indicate that WTO members took an important first step at MC12, but it's not the final step. I think there's more work to be done, and that's why we have this second wave to be able to fully meet the mandate given to us under SDG 14.6. So now what everyone is working towards, it's ratification as was outlined before. And once that ratification is done, then we have a timeline to be able to conclude the negotiations. Otherwise, well, the termination clause kicks in. So hopefully we don't reach that stage. But I think in terms of implementation, and when you go through the text, even though what we agreed is a slimmed down version of what was initially envisaged, when you go through the text, there's a lot of information that members will need to provide. So I think perhaps notifications and transparency stands out. A second thing that stands out to me, it's the coordination mechanisms that members will need to establish domestically to be able to implement the agreement. Data collection will be key. And just following the sequence of the agreement, I think starting with the IUU pillar, I think to ensure that you are able to withdraw subsidies when a final determination is made, members will need to set up mechanisms which will involve interagency coordination. So not just fisheries ministries, but other agencies that are involved to ensure the subsidy is prohibited once the final determination is made. It also involves, I think, a lot of sharing of information, not only domestically, but with third parties. And here I'm talking about other WTO members in the case of when a foreign vessel fishes in your waters, but also with RFMOs, because if an IUU determination is made within the jurisdiction of an RFMO, it affects either the flag state member or the subsidizing member, who will be, in this case, perhaps the coastal state. But if the vessel or operator is fishing outside its jurisdiction. This will involve also, I think, reform of national fisheries policies and laws to ensure that your legislations are sort of synchronized with the fisheries subsidies agreement. When you look at the IUU pillar, there's a specific reference in Article 3.7 that states that each member shall have laws, regulations, and administrative procedures in place to ensure that subsidies are not granted or maintained for IUU fishing. Now, if a particular WTO member does not have such provisions in place currently, then it will need to undergo a process of domestic reform to make sure that their national laws and policies have these procedures in place. So I think there will be a lot of reforms ongoing in a lot of countries to ensure that their national laws are aligned with the fisheries subsidies agreement. On overfished stocks, I think here it's a very straightforward prohibition, but I think what members will need to do internally is to perhaps do an inventory of the fish stocks that they have already recognized as overfished, and then cross-check it with whether they are providing actual subsidies to those fish stocks. Now, if you are providing those subsidies, then of course you have to withdraw those subsidies unless they meet the flexibility in 4.3 that Say and Ernesto were talking about earlier. On Article 5 on other subsidies, the prohibition to unregulated high seas, again, is very straightforward, but then members will just need to make sure that they know when they provide subsidies to vessels or operators, that these vessels or operators are only fishing within the coastal state or within the jurisdiction of an RFMO, so that they're not going beyond into the unregulated high seas. So here location is key, just being able to monitor your vessels to make sure that whoever you're giving these subsidies to stays within a particular jurisdiction. The special care and due restraint that Say mentioned, I think yes, it's a best endeavor clause, but I think members will need to demonstrate that they have undertaken some efforts to exercise due restraint, because otherwise other members can question you on it, on whether you're actually taking special care and due restraint. So some minimal effort will need to be undertaken, I think, even though this is a best endeavor clause. As I mentioned before, I think notifications and transparency is perhaps the key one in this agreement when it comes to domestic implementation. It's not only the fisheries subsidies that we have to notify under Article 25 of the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, but now we are being required to notify to the WTO a lot of fisheries management data, such as fish stock data, fleet capacity, catch data. Now, this is very data intensive, and for a lot of countries, they may not already have these information readily available. So setting up mechanisms to ensure that you're able to collect this information in a timely manner and then also notifying it to the WTO. I think this will be key when it comes to the provisions on the notifications and transparency. Going to your second question as to which implementation steps seem to be more challenging. For me, it's obvious it's notification and transparency, because being able to set up these mechanisms, which involves interagency coordination, being able to regularly collect this information, record it, and then notify it to the WTO, I think it's going to take time, it's going to take effort, and it might also require assistance, whether in the form of technical assistance and capacity building, to be able to collect and then notify this information to the WTO. Another point, which I think is perhaps very challenging and not only challenging, but costly, is the issue of stock assessment. Because the agreement requires members to at least know the status of fish stocks before they're able to provide subsidies for those fish stocks. And stock assessments, as we all know, are very expensive. I don't think they're conducted on a regular basis in many developing countries and LDCs because of the cost element. So the fish fund, the voluntary fish fund that is envisaged under Article 7 will come in handy here to help members to be able to conduct these stock assessments. Another point that I would like to make is the issue of identifying overfish stocks. As you know, many developing countries and LDCs have multi-species fisheries, and they're also data poor. So the issue of perhaps having tailored approaches to the circumstances of each fishery, and this may involve traditional methods to be able to conduct the stock assessments, will also be key in terms of implementation. A last point, I think, goes back to the utilization of the flexibility in Article 4.3 of the overfish stock pillar. Here again, you know, it's not just being able to provide the subsidies, but it's also having other measures in place to ensure that you're rebuilding the stock. Now, making such a demonstration, I think, will be quite costly, again, for developing countries and LDCs, given the capacity constraints that we already face. So it takes me now perhaps to the last question you raised, Alice, which was on the type of assistance that may be most useful to support implementation. I think those who are familiar with the history of the negotiations will recall that the LDC group was actually the first to put forward a proposal, I think in March 2020, about a voluntary trust fund to help members in implementation. So we were quite happy to see this reflected in the final agreement in Article 7, but we'll also give the credit to the DG, since she also pushed to make that happen. So making sure that that trust fund is operational, I think, as we start implementation, will be key, and helping members to implement the agreement. To address some of these challenges that I mentioned earlier, like notifications, you know, the withdrawal of subsidies, I think these are all aspects that are linked to binding commitments. But I think Ernesto made a point that struck me, was that that the effectiveness of the agreement will depend on members' management, monitoring, and enforcement. Now, this goes beyond compliance, I think. But I think if we are serious about not only eliminating or combating IUU, but also sustainability, then I think WTO members and you know, the international community needs to help developing countries and LDCs to be able to achieve or help contribute to the long-term achievements of the fisheries agreement, even if they're not immediately linked to the new obligations that are contained. So this is important, I think, for IUU monitoring and enforcement, even though we know making an IUU determination is not an obligation, but it's important that, you know, developing countries and LDCs are able to receive support to strengthen their IUU monitoring and mechanisms to be able to, you know, make determinations against foreign vessels fishing illegally in their waters. So I think this is something that is key, being able to make stock assessments and, of course, the fisheries management measures. So I think these are the steps that I think would be most useful to support implementation. And I think for those countries who are beneficiaries of technical assistance and capacity building, one step that they could take to perhaps identify the challenges that they face internally to be able to comply with the obligations in the agreement is to sort of do a needs assessment. I think we have history of such an approach with the trade facilitation agreement, where members do sort of an internal assessment to see what gaps exist and where future capacity building will really help in terms of implementation. So I think that that is something that members should be able to do to be able to identify the gaps that they currently face to be able to implement the agreement. I'll leave it at that and happy to come back if there are any additional questions. Many thanks.
No, thank you, Asan. That was super. And I thought particularly important to underline the difference between what's required to comply specifically with the obligations and what might be helpful to ensure that the agreement has broader effectiveness in terms of sustainability. And I'm delighted that we have colleagues from the FAO in the room who are no doubt listening to that carefully. You talked about notifications and transparency. You talked about gathering information, and you talked about, in particular at the end, the process of conducting a needs assessment, right? So countries can walk through what they need to do in order to become aligned with the agreement and to stay aligned. And that's the perfect segue, in fact, into Tristan's presentation, because this, in fact, is the purpose of the toolkit that he and my colleague Eva have been working on. So Tristan, would you like to walk us through that next?
Sure, thanks a lot, Alice, and hello, everyone. I'm quite happy to be here to speak about this tool because we've been working on it for a while, so it's quite nice to be able to present it, or at least give you a preview today. So in the next 15 minutes, I'll try to give you a short overview of the tool, but I thought I would start with a few preliminary remarks. So if we can move to the first slide, and you can go and present a view, yeah. So first, I wanted to share these preliminary remarks, highlighting, as mentioned, that the self-assessment tool has been designed to support WTO members' efforts to prepare and to guide the implementation of the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement. And it will be published on IISD's website next week. We will also send it to WTO missions, so it should reach delegates and missions through various channels. So the tool will be made available to all WTO members. Government officials can then download it. They can use it internally within their respective administrations, so in a confidential way. And that means that each member using the tool will use it for itself and will decide for itself what to do with the results. So some members may choose to keep all the information for themselves. Others may choose to share parts of the results, for example, with funders or assistance providers, but it's really up to them. It's their decision. It's also important to note that the tool is not an official legal interpretation of the agreement. So it's only IISD's attempt to provide some guidance on what we think the new rules mean and what they require in terms of implementation, but it should not be taken as legal advice. If we can move to next slide. So let's now look at this tool together. The tool includes two separate documents. The first and the core document of the tool is what we call the checklist. It's essentially a series of tables to be filled out by providing information and by answering questions. And that's really the center of the self-assessment exercise. That's the document on which government officials will work when they go through the self-assessment exercise. The second document is what we call the guide, and it's meant to be really a supporting document that provides explanations about how to fill the checklist. So for each table and for each column and each question of each table, there will be a corresponding part in the guide with detailed explanations in case guidance is helpful. The tool has been developed to help WTO members do several things. And this is the second part of the slide that you see here. First, it will help WTO members to collect and to record key information and data that's needed for implementation. And this is done through what we call inventory tables. We'll come back to that in some of the next slides. Second, the tool will allow members to assess their current level of alignment with the new rules and to identify whether any immediate corrective action would be needed to align with those rules. So here, this is really about the current policy situation. And that would, for example, be about questions such as, is there any prohibited subsidy that is provided today? Third, the tool helps members to assess whether the mechanisms needed for ongoing alignment with the new rules are in place domestically. So this aspect here you will see is more about the long term than the previous one, and we'll come back to that distinction. And finally, the tool will also help members to identify and articulate where they would need technical assistance and capacity building for implementing the agreement. And we hope this will be a particularly useful aspect of the tool for developing countries who choose to use it. We can move to the next slide. So this is the first step that I mentioned in the previous slide, which is about collecting key information that's needed for implementation. And this first step of information collection is guided in the checklist by what we call inventory tables. And there are 4 of these inventory tables. The first table allows to record information on fisheries subsidies, so essentially a list of all the subsidies that fall within the scope of the agreement and related information. The second table is to collect information on subsidized fisheries, meaning the fleets that are subsidized, but also the stocks they fish. And here there is a small add-on table to that table, which is about catch data. So catch data that's available can be recorded there. The third table allows to record information on the status of fish stocks. So it's going to be particularly relevant for implementation of the overfished stocks subsidy prohibition. And finally, the fourth table is meant to collect information on the vessels and operators that are identified as having engaged in IUU fishing, and so mostly relevant for the discipline on IUU fishing, and in particular the IUU fishing subsidy prohibition. Next slide. So I just wanted to show you an example of what those inventory tables look like. This one is the first one, the subsidy inventory table, in which all subsidies that are relevant from the agreement's perspective can be recorded. I won't go into too much detail for the sake of time, but it should provide you with a good idea of the type of information that's included in those tables. So you'll see that there's information about program name, the authority responsible for a subsidy, the form and type of a subsidy, a description, as well as information on the amount. There are also 2 columns that you will see on the right and that ask whether each subsidy fulfills particular criteria. And this information will be useful to determine whether some of the rules apply to various subsidies. One remark is that the tool is not cast in stone. So if by using it, users realize that some additional information would be useful in the context of some tables, be it this one or others, they can very well adjust the tool and add some more information. And last remark, this is only an example, and there are other inventory tables, as I mentioned, but that was just to give you a sense. We can move to the next slide. So once that initial phase of information collection, which the tool can help members to do, has been done, users can move to the core part of the tool, which is really focused on the legal obligations that are included in the treaty. And what the tool does here is that it takes those legal obligations one by one, and for each of those obligations, they are addressed in two distinct steps, which are represented by two distinct tables. And so that's what I've tried to show to you with this slide. So first, for each obligation, there is what we call a current alignment table. And what this table allows to do is to assess a member's current level of alignment with the obligation, and to identify any immediate action that would be required to align with this obligation. So it's really about today, right? It's about the policy situation today. It's a snapshot of the immediate alignment situation at the moment the self-assessment is made. So to give you a concrete example, those tables, they would typically ask questions to determine whether any prohibited subsidies are provided today. And we'll see a concrete example of one such table on the next slide. But let's stay on the previous slide, please. So the second step through which each obligation is addressed is what we call the ongoing alignment table. And what this table will allow to do is to assess whether the domestic mechanisms needed to enable ongoing alignment with an obligation are currently in place. If they are not, it also allows to identify what are the gaps. And when there are some gaps, it allows to identify and to articulate any possible needs for technical assistance and capacity building. So here, the question is not about current alignment today, but rather it's about the existence of domestic mechanisms or the existence of a domestic system to enable members to be and to remain aligned with the obligation in an ongoing way. So to put it simply, the type of question that would be asked for current alignment is something like, do I provide any prohibited subsidy today, in very simple terms? And the type of questions that would be asked in an ongoing alignment table is more something like, do my legislation and procedures operate in a way that prevents the provision of prohibited subsidies, both now and in the future? If we move to the next slide now, this will show you an example of a current alignment table, in this case for the IUU fishing prohibition. The question you see here in the red box is a simplified question. It's disaggregated in the actual checklist, but it's been simplified just to give you a clear sense of the type of questions that is asked. And here you see what I said about in the last slide about the type of question, right? Does the member provide subsidies to vessels or operators identified as engaged in IUU fishing? And we see that it's clearly about current alignment, because it's about whether today any prohibited subsidy are provided to IUU vessels or operators. You'll also see that before replying to the question, there is a column that gives some guidance on the type of information that would be needed to provide this answer. And here, very often, this column would refer to those inventory tables I mentioned at the beginning. So this shows how filling such inventory tables will be useful to conduct that self-assessment exercise. And finally, the last column would indicate any further action that needs to be taken in light of the response that is provided in the yes, no, unknown column. So typically it would say something like, if no, you have nothing to do, no action is required. If yes, then relevant subsidies should be removed in a slightly more detailed way, but that is the idea. We can move to the next slide, which here provides you with a similar example, but this time for the other type of table, for this second step that the tool allows to go through for each obligation. So it's an example of those ongoing alignment tables. And so again, I won't go into all the details of that table, but first you'll see that the type of question is very different in that table. So in the current alignment, it was whether any prohibited subsidy is provided today or at the moment the self-assessment is made. Here we see that the questions are more about the mechanisms, so the laws, the regulations, the procedures that need to be in place so that no prohibited subsidies are provided either now or in the future. So in an ongoing way. The second question here, for example, is do the domestic laws, regulations, and administrative procedures that govern the provision of subsidies operate so that no subsidy can be provided to vessels or operators that are subject to an IUU determinations? And here again, you'll see that the table asks for a simple yes/no answer, if possible. And then it allows to describe the domestic current situation regarding such ongoing alignment mechanisms. It allows to identify the actions that would be required to establish such mechanisms if they are not in place. And finally, you will see that the last column on the right is about technical assistance and capacity building needs. And so the idea here is that for each obligation, users can use this column to identify and articulate needs for assistance in a structured and quite detailed way. And once they have done so, it may help their governments to make requests for assistance that are targeted. And we hope it may help them to make such requests in a more compelling way. So we think that's quite an important aspect of those tables. So that's why I wanted to highlight this. We can move to the last slide. And here I just wanted to make a few very quick remarks on the guide, just to emphasize that it's a supporting document, so it should be used if and when useful. It doesn't need to be read from the first to the last page. It gives some general background on the tool and on the agreement itself. It helps to fill those inventory tables at the beginning of the tool. And then for each legal obligation of the treaty, it gives the legal provisions of the agreement. It includes a summary box to present the obligation in a concise way. It provides general explanations, but maybe most importantly, it provides detailed explanations on how to answer every particular question that you will find in those current alignment tables or ongoing alignment tables. So for each part of the checklist, there is a dedicated section in the guide that can be consulted if there is a need for guidance. And that's about it for me. We can move to the next slide. Just a last remark to say that we are available. So if you're interested in that tool and would like to hear more about it, we would be happy to organize discussions, to answer questions. So feel free to reach out to the team. You have our email addresses there. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Tristan. I think the three of us are probably the only ones who read the guide from the first page to the end. Listen, I've been flashing my phone around because I have a question from online about LDCs that I'm going to ask Hassan to answer. And I have a question about the conservation impact of the agreement, which I'm going to ask Ernesto to answer. But are there any questions or comments from the room that you'd like to put to the panelists or just to comment on for the benefit of others? Yes, go ahead, please. Let us know who you are.
Yes, didn't plan to ask the first question, but I'll go for it now. So my name is Robert Wager. I'm an exchange student here at the University of Geneva and studying law, and I'm a biologist already. I have a diploma in biology. So basically, excuse if my question will reflect a lack of understanding of basic WTO functioning, but basically, what I would be interested in to know more and more in detail, in the very first presentation, it was stated that this agreement would be enforceable through the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. And after that, I've heard a lot about how much the success of the agreement and the outcome and the effect would depend on the voluntary action contribution of member states. And so basically my question would be then how does it in the end work to translate the functioning of the agreement into concrete trade negotiations and trade agreement in the end? So how exactly is it then the incentive created for members to actually comply in the end concretely with existing legislation, basically also? So I cannot really make the connection yet what the incentive would be for members to comply and align. Thank you.
That's a super question. I think what I heard the panel, I'll let Sai answer that if she'd like to. And then I'll let you know the question for Ernesto was in particular, there have been some criticisms of the agreement saying that it doesn't go far enough and disappointment that there were some rules that weren't concluded. And the question that came was, how would you respond to conservationists who are disappointed with what was left out of the agreement? I'm going to let the conservationist on the panel answer that question. And the question to Hassan, just to let you all know, was in particular about the article of the agreement that speaks specifically to LDCs, right? And I guess the question is specifically what sorts of particular situations might LDCs find themselves in that should be taken into particular account when members raise issues under the agreement with LDCs. And given that Hassan coordinated the LDC group during the negotiations, I have a perfect respondent for that question. If there was nothing else from the room, Sai, I think as I hear the question, it's a question I think about incentives for implementation and for compliance. Partly they will come from the dispute settlement system within the WTO, but I think the point is the broader impact of the agreement will depend on how much and how far countries implement it, members implement it, and what they might do in addition. But I'd like to hear your sense, of the Secretariat's sense, of where the incentives for implementation come from, and then I'll hand it to Ernesto.
No, thank you, Alice. And just to come back to Robert's point about the dispute settlement system, and I'm assuming you already understand how the DSU works at the WTO, and this is why, compared to other initiatives that do, such as the USMCA or the CPTPP, that members do view this agreement as more effective in terms of enforcement, because there would be accountability for the members. So if we're thinking about the WTO dispute settlement system, in that case, if the subsidy is prohibited and a member does not remove the subsidy, there's room for discourse through the DSU. Vice versa, if a member also is in the view that their subsidy is not prohibited, they also have that avenue to go through the discourse. So the incentive, at least from the WTO perspective, is that there will be accountability, but also we should remember that dispute settlement is really the last resort in the WTO. And there's a lot of important work that happens at the committee level. And it comes back to what Hassan was saying before about notification and transparency and the exchange of information and consulting amongst members. So the committee work is the bread and butter of the functioning of the agreement. And for example, sitting in this room with 164 members to not only notify the information that you're required to, which is extensive, but also to exchange on the practices and to ask questions with regards to the programs. So all of that would happen before you get to disputes. And we've seen that in other parts of the WTO and other agreements where a vast majority of issues are resolved pre-disputes through the committee process before you get to dispute settlement. So at least from our perspective, that's the added value of dispute settlement. And perhaps someone else would like to add on that.
We could, but we don't have time. Ernesto,
Yeah.
one minute on the conservation perspective.
Yeah, and I support everything just I said regarding dispute settlement, which is and I didn't mention this expressly, but one of the elements of value of having an agreement that will be applicable to all 164 members, and there will be resources to the dispute settlements in case there's no application. But from the conservation perspective, yeah, we will like to see more, and we were pushing for, prohibition of all harmful subsidies. That was not possible, but I think this is important step, as we have been saying. It's the significance of having an agreement at the WTO is very important, and having no agreement, I mean, we will not be able to make governments accountable. So yeah, with those two elements, I will conclude, but I think yeah, we cannot underestimate the importance of the agreement.
Super. Asan, the last word to you. What do we need to think about when we think about LDCs in this context?
To answer the specific question
Yeah.
you asked on the Article 6.
The provisions.
The provision, yeah, I think those familiar with the dispute settlement understanding will recall that this is standard language that draws from there, that members shall really exercise due restraint when bringing LDC issues into dispute. And I think this rarely happens, but it's sort of like a provision that members just keep in the back of their mind, that given the capacity constraints and the unique circumstances of LDCs, when they perhaps flout the rules or do not fulfill certain obligations, you exercise due restraint when bringing matters of dispute into action. So I think that's the genesis of the provision, and I think all members agreed to that when it was proposed. So there was no pushback from anyone.
Super. I don't think a dispute has ever been brought against an LDC. We're at time. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. We hope you found this interesting. If you're interested in the slides in particular, don't hesitate to get in touch. And Tristan is off the hook for questions. Thank you very much all for joining us, and thank you to both the interpreters and those who've joined us online. And enjoy the rest of this Trade Environment Week. Thank you very much.